Good afternoon, a guten Erev Shabbos. Great to be learning with you on a Friday. Excuse me. Let's light up the darkness. Whoa. I am a little under the weather still, but I'm quite excited about today, and I'll explain why in a moment. Who's in the house? Bella in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandor in the Bronx, Gordo in Scotland, Chaim in Florida, Debbie in New Jersey, Elise in Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Did I say Lorraine in Texas? And Sharon says, Sai has enticed the dogs to join us for class today. Good day for it. So, as Henry V would say, we few, we happy few, who were with us on St. Crispin's Day, whatever that was, that pre-battle speech. Friday, so we typically are less people joining us live because of the schedule is so different compared to the rest of the week. But this is a great daf. Whoa, what a great daf. As so often happens, remember that the Mishna, the Gemara, just goes along with the Mishna, and the Mishna was organized to be memorized. That's why I'm actually also attending a class now. We're learning Tractate Megillah 3 nights a week, and I've been phoning it in while I've been a little ill. But it's nice to be learning that. And Rabbi Meni Chazanov, who teaches that, was just saying last night that, in Tractate Megillah, where, it says like if it was possible that Purim could have been celebrated both in the first Adar and the second Adar, at the time when the Sanhedrin would determine whether a second month of Adar would be added to the calendar. A leap year in the Jewish calendar adds an extra month, the second Adar, and Adar is the month that contains Purim. So it's possible that you could have had 2 Purims in 1 year when the Sanhedrin was determining those things, and if they added it late. But then, having said that, the only difference between a first and second Adar Purim is such and such. The next Mishnah is, and the only difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov is with respect to the laws of cooking. What does Shabbos and Yom Tov have to do with Tractate Megillah, which is the laws of Purim? Nothing except that, having used that locution, there is no difference between this and that other than this little thing. And then it does the same thing. There's no difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur except with respect to such and such. Because it was designed to be memorized, right? So here, today we're going to do the final Mishnah of chapter 13. That's relatively quick. And then we're going to go to chapter 14, the final chapter of Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud that we're in now. And the first Mishnah is one of the longest Mishnahs that there is. The longest is in Tractate Yuma, about the Yom Kippur service. But this is one of the longest Mishnahs. And it really spells out what the offerings are, right? So if we were going to organize Tractate Zevachim, we probably would have wanted to start with that, if the purpose were to publish a printed book. But because it was organized to be memorized, they went right into a topic that they found very interesting. But if you think that they had the whole Mishnah memorized, so it was always available to them in their heads. Your head is the most amazing supercomputer there is once you've got the material stored in there, so to speak. But today we'll get into like the list of the offerings. It's under the rubric of, well, if it's not one of the actual offerings, then if you offered up outside the Holy Temple, you would not be liable for offering up outside the Holy Temple. And so that discussion will be interesting, and it becomes especially interesting, I would say fascinating. We've been talking a lot about what were those we've mentioned a bunch of times, what were those periods in history when private altars were permitted. So we're going to get deeper into that in that Mishnah. Usually we don't get into any historical ideas except, really once we get to the Gemara on a Mishnah. Today it'll be in the Mishnah itself and in the notes on it that is provided by the Koren and by Rav Steinsaltz. But now we'll understand a little bit better what it was like when Joshua led the children of Israel into the Holy Land, what the Torah said about that period where God basically said, before you've come to rest, right? So there would be the period of conquest. And during the period of conquest, they were going to be busy fighting off and defeating, these really dastardly people who were occupying the land at that time, practicing child sacrifice, cultic sex, all kinds of stuff. And until the land was rid of those people and those wars of conquest were over, so they didn't have a national altar. Then they did, right? And so that became Shiloh. And then later, we learn in Psalms, God forsook Shiloh. The level of the people had dropped somewhat, but that was in anticipation of going up again with the coming of David and Solomon, eventually designating the new place for God's resting place in the world in Jerusalem. And so there would be these two periods, right after coming in and later after the fall of Shiloh, when there were private altars permitted for private sacrifices, individual sacrifices, not for national sacrifices. But we'll be talking more about that today. I think it's a really, really fascinating daf. You're happy you came today. And I'm still a little under the weather, but I'm jazzed and energized to teach this material. So hopefully it will go well. Okay, we're picking this up at near the bottom of 111b. With Mishnah number 9, the final Mishnah of chapter 13. Okay, which this whole chapter has been about whether one is liable for offering up something that is fit to offer God, but instead of offering it up in the Holy Temple, or the tabernacle for that matter, and instead he offered it up outside on some kind of private altar. Okay, so with regard to a sin offering, where one collected its blood into one cup, if he first placed its blood on an altar outside the courtyard, and then he placed the remaining blood on the altar inside the courtyard, or if he first placed its blood on the altar inside the courtyard, and then he placed the remaining blood on an altar outside the courtyard, in both cases he is liable for placing the blood outside the courtyard, as the blood in its entirety is fit to be placed on the altar inside the courtyard. Okay, so he did a sin offering, slaughtered properly, collected the blood in a service vessel, and then either he took some of that blood outside the Holy Temple and sacrificed it on some private altar, obviously liable for offering up outside. And if he came back and put the rest of that blood, sprinkled it on the altar or on its base, doesn't matter. He's liable for offering up outside. And if he first put some of that blood on the altar in the Holy Temple, right, that external altar, the main altar, but then he left the Holy Temple, the courtyard of the Holy Temple, and the rest of that blood, which sounds like remainder, right, But in this case, we're not calling it remainder blood, which would not trigger this liability. Rather, since the blood could have been put on, I guess we're not calling it remainder yet. Maybe some of that blood should have been used on the altar in the courtyard. So he took it outside and put on that private altar, liable for offering up outside the holy temple. Now, different case. If one collected its blood in 2 cups, right, it's a little different. In 2 cups rather than 1 cup. Again, we're talking about service vessel, so it's a consecrated vessel. Blood properly, from an animal that was properly shechted in the courtyard of the temple. And its blood was collected in 2 cups. Okay, and he placed the blood from both of them on the altar inside the courtyard. Well, he's exempt from liability as he acted appropriately. That's what we're supposed to do. You collect the blood from the slaughter and then place it on the altar. If he placed the blood from both of them on the altar outside the courtyard, well, obviously he's liable, as this is exactly offering up outside the holy temple something that was fit to be placed on the altar. If on the real altar. So if he first placed the blood from 1 cup inside, and then he placed the blood from the other cup outside, now he's exempt. By using the blood of the first cup to perform the mitzvah of placing the blood on the altar, he thereby rendered the blood in the second cup unfit to be placed on the altar. Therefore, there is no liability for placing it on a private altar outside the temple. If he first placed the blood from 1 cup outside and then placed the blood from the other one inside, he is liable for the external placement, as that blood was fit to be placed inside. So he's liable for offering up outside the holy temple. And then interesting additional fact, and the internal placement atones for the transgression for which the sin offering was brought. So the fact that he took the first cup and placed it on the private altar outside the temple did not disqualify the other cup. So the remaining cup that he then placed on the altar in the holy temple still achieves the atonement that the owner of the sin offering sought to achieve, right? He has effected atonement for that person. But the one who offers that cup of blood, that first cup, outside the holy temple is guilty, is liable for offering up outside the temple. Now the Mishnah adds something that it doesn't usually do, an analogy. So to what is this matter comparable? It is comparable to a case where one separated an animal for his sin offering, okay, designated an animal to be his sin offering. When does somebody bring a sin offering? When he's obligated to bring a sin offering. So he designates an animal to fulfill his obligation to bring a sin offering. And that animal was lost. And so he separated another animal in its place. And thereafter, the first animal was found. So in that case, both of them stand before him, and he must sacrifice one as his sin offering. If he slaughtered both of them inside the courtyard, he is exempt. If he slaughtered both of them outside the courtyard, he is liable, as each was fit to be slaughtered in the courtyard. If he first slaughtered one inside and then he slaughtered the other one outside, he is exempt from liability for slaughtering the second, as he has already fulfilled his obligation with the first, thereby rendering the second one unfit for sacrifice, because his obligation has been fulfilled. If he first slaughtered one outside and then slaughtered the other one inside, he is liable for slaughtering the external animal outside the courtyard, as it was fit to be slaughtered inside. And, interesting, the internal animal atones for the transgression for which the sin offering was brought. The fact that he committed the sin of slaughtering outside the holy temple with one of the animals doesn't change the fact that the animal that remained fit can still fulfill his obligation to bring a sin offering. Now, since we're talking about liability here, generally we're talking about intentional. So, if he did this unwittingly, he would be liable to bring another sin offering. But that's not going to be covered by the remaining animal that's going to, fulfill his obligation for that first sin offering. You may need to bring another sin offering for the unwitting violation of offering up outside, or if he did that on purpose, he's liable to chorus. But it doesn't change the fact that the remaining animal that is fit to be slaughtered was slaughtered inside the courtyard, so that will affect atonement for the original sin that he needed to bring a sin offering for. And the Mishnah adds, in a case where one slaughtered both animals inside the courtyard, just as placing the blood of the first animal exempts one who consumes its meat from liability for me'ila, misuse of consecrated property, so too it exempts one who consumes the meat of its counterpart, the second animal, from liability. That's the Mishnah, now the Gemara, and now we're at the top of 112a. The Gemara says, the Gemara discusses the first clause of this Mishnah. Granted that one is liable in a case where he first placed the blood on an altar outside the courtyard, and then he placed the remaining blood on the altar inside the courtyard, and that is because, as the Mishnah explains, as the blood in its entirety is fit to be placed inside the courtyard. But in a case where he first placed his blood on the altar inside the courtyard, and then he offered up the remaining blood on the altar outside the courtyard, why is he liable? That blood is merely a remainder, and one should not be liable for offering it up outside. And so here, what we're going to get into the discussion of is the concept of remainder versus, I don't even know what we'd call it, remainder versus second cup, okay? So the remainder is if the blood was collected, an animal was properly slaughtered in the Holy Temple courtyard, its blood was collected, right? The blood of the soul, let's just remind ourselves, that's the blood that when the animal is shechted, right? The sharp blade brought across its throat, blood gushes out. As that blood leaves the body of the sacrificial animal, it dies. That's the blood that needs to be collected in the service vessel. From that service vessel, it's only a bit of the blood that's actually sprinkled on the altar. And then what remains in that vessel, that's the remainder. And the instruction is to pour that out on the base of the altar. And even though that's the proper procedure, it's not an indispensable procedure. So that if the sprinkling was done, but the blood was lost before the remainder was poured on the base, the person has fulfilled his obligation. If it was to bring a sin offering, he has effected atonement. If there's blood in a second cup, well, the sprinkling was done from the first cup. So the fact that there was another cup, that's not a remainder. That's a second source of the same blood, let's say, a second collection of the same blood of the soul. That's why it becomes disqualified, right? We don't sprinkle from it, and we don't pour it out on the base. Rather, that is disposed of respectfully, but not by pouring it out on the base, because it's no longer involved in the sacrificial process. It gets poured into a special drain in the temple floor. Basically the temple floor, and it goes out in the drainage system of the Holy Temple, I believe, to the Kidron River. Okay, so let's keep reading here. So the Gemara explains, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nehemiah, who says, for the remainder of the blood of an offering that was supposed to be poured at the base of the altar, and that instead one sacrificed outside the courtyard, one is liable. That's not the law, right? And there was a little bit of a misunderstanding between him and Rabbi Akiva, but basically Rabbi Akiva was saying, no, I mean, the pouring the remainder on the base is not indispensable, and therefore if you took that blood outside, you would not have offered up something that is fit to be sacrificed, and so you would not be liable for offering up outside the Holy Temple. Now, but Rabbi Nehemiah says, no, pouring out the remainder on the base is essential, and therefore if you took that blood and sacrificed it outside the Holy Temple, you would be liable. Minority opinion. We don't follow Rabbi Nehemiah. Generally, we follow, when there's a dispute between Rabbi Akiva and a single other sage, the law is according to Rabbi Akiva. Okay, the Gemara asks, if the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nehemiah, then say the latter clause, if one collected its blood in 2 cups and placed the blood from both of them on the altar inside the courtyard, he is exempt. If he placed the blood from both of them on the altar outside the courtyard, he is liable. If he first placed the blood from one cup inside and then placed the blood from the other outside, he is exempt. By using the blood of the first cup to perform the mitzvah of placing the blood on the altar, he thereby rendered the blood in the second cup a mere remainder. And the Gemara asks, how can this clause be attributed to Rabbi Nehemiah? But doesn't Rabbi Nehemiah say, for the remainder of the blood of an offering that one offered outside, he is liable? And the Mishnah said that the second cup, if you pour that outside after having poured the first cup inside, you're not liable. So the Gemara answers, in the latter clause, we arrive at the opinion of a different sage. We arrive at the opinion of the first Tana, who disagrees with Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. As that Tana says, the placement of the blood from one cup renders the blood of the other cup disqualified. Since it is actually disqualified and not merely a remainder, one is not liable for offering it up outside. Next topic, the Mishnah presents an analogy. Right, the Mishnah added this analogy, comparing the blood in the two cups to having two animals for the same sin offering, because the animal that was designated for the sin offering was lost at the time that the person sought to bring it. So he substituted another animal so he could fulfill his obligation. And then he found the first animal. So now he's got two animals designated for the same offering. That's why blood in two cups from the same animal is analogous to having two animals designated to atone for the same sin via a sin offering. So the Mishnah presents an analogy for its ruling. To what is this matter comparable? It is comparable to a case where one separated an animal for a sin offering and it was lost, and he separated another animal in its place, and thereafter the first animal was found. And the Gemara asks, why do I need to ask, to what is this matter comparable, and provide an analogy to the Mishnah's rulings? What does the analogy add? So the Gemara explains, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who says in Tractate Temura 22b, a sin offering that was lost during the time of the separation of a substitute, if it is later found and one of them is slaughtered as the person's sin offering, the other one is put to death. Accordingly, it is actually disqualified from being used as an offering, and one is therefore not liable for offering it up outside. Right? So what they're going to disagree on, two views. So, right, this happened. You had an animal designated to be a sin offering. It got lost. You brought in another one to do the same job, and then you found the first one. So what are you going to do? You've got two animals for the same sin offering. Okay, one of them you're going to bring as a sin offering. The other one, you can't do anything with it, right? You can't do anything with it because it was designated for this, and the other animal already did that job, so it's just going to have to be put to death. It can't be used for any other purpose. That's one view. And this is what the Mishnah is saying by presenting its analogy. The reason that one is exempt from liability for offering up the unused sin offering outside is that it was lost at the time its substitute was separated, and therefore it is considered disqualified. But if one separated two sin offerings from the outset, this would be more similar to collecting the blood in two cups. If one separated two sin offerings from the outset, as a guarantee, meaning he said, okay, well, just in case one of these animals, just in case my animal gets lost, I want to have a second animal so that I can be sure to bring my sin offering on the date that I'm going to be in Jerusalem, something like that. But he separated two animals from the outset for one sin offering, right? So, okay, from the outset, he's just making sure that he's going to have the animal. If one of them gets lost, perfect, he's covered. But if both animals are still there at the time that he brings the sin offering, what's he going to do with the second? Does that one just get killed? So that even if one is lost, he can use the other. Then, if neither is lost and he sacrifices one of them, the other one is not put to death. Rather, it is left to graze until it becomes blemished, at which point it is sold, and the proceeds are used to purchase a voluntary burnt offering. It emerges that from the outset, one of these two animals, i.e. the one that was not ultimately sacrificed as his sin offering, was therefore designated to be a burnt offering. And therefore, if one offers it up outside the courtyard, he would be liable for offering up outside. Whereas in the case where his animal got lost, then he designated another one, then he found the first animal, he offers up that animal, the second one then becomes disqualified, and he offered that outside the courtyard, he would be exempt because it was disqualified and therefore not fit for the altar, and that's why he would not be liable for offering up outside the courtyard. And this is in accordance with the statement of that Rav Huna says that Rav says. As Rav Huna says that Rav says, a guilt offering that was consigned to grazing, right? Because you can't bring as an offering, right? But it's consecrated, so you can't just let it go back to the flock. That's why it grazes until it develops a blemish. When it has a blemish, then it becomes unfit for the altar. You can sell it, use that money to purchase another animal that will act as a burnt offering, right? That's what we do. That's what left to graze means. And this is so Rav Huna says that Rav says a guilt offering that was consigned to grazing per the law to leave it to graze if its owner dies or achieves atonement through another guilt offering. And then instead of being left to develop a blemish, at which point it could be sold and the proceeds used to purchase a voluntary burnt offering, instead one slaughtered it, even without specified intent. The animal itself is fit to be sacrificed as a burnt offering, right? It was a consecrated animal. The law is you're supposed to leave it to graze. Okay, well, a mistake was made. They slaughtered it. It never developed the blemish, so it's still fit for the altar. Because of the way the law works, it shouldn't have been brought, but now, after the fact, it can be. The animal itself is fit to be sacrificed as a burnt offering. So similarly, the Mishnah assumes that in any case where an animal is consigned to grazing, it is technically still fit for the altar. And one would therefore be liable for slaughtering it outside the courtyard. And the Gemara asks, are these cases comparable? There in Rav's ruling, it is logical that the animal is considered fit, as a guilt offering is a male animal and a burnt offering is a male animal. So okay, an animal designated to be a guilt offering can become a burnt offering. But sin offerings are female animals. So a female animal can't become a burnt offering. So then what? But in the Mishnah's case, just because the animal is left to graze does not necessarily indicate that it itself is fit to be brought as a sin offering, because a sin offering is a female animal, which can never be brought as a burnt offering. Therefore, it should be considered unfit. And if it is unfit, then you would not be liable for offering it up outside. Again, in all these cases, if you offer up an animal, on an altar outside, you're doing something wrong. But if it's unfit for the altar, you would not have violated the specific prohibition of offering up outside the holy temple, because that requires something that was fit to bring up on the altar inside the temple. Rav Chia bar Yostaniya reconciled this problem by saying the ruling of the Mishnah is with regard to the goat of the Nasi, which is a male sin offering. Therefore, in a case where it is left to graze, it is still considered fit, as it can be brought as a burnt offering. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 9 here in chapter 13. We move on to chapter 14, which is going to both quickly list all the offerings that aren't offerings, a very interesting list, and talks about that period in history when private altars were permitted. We keep alluding to it. Now we're going to learn more about that. So before we start this chapter, let me read to you this passage from Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 8 through 14. Says God, you shall not do, says Moses, as commanded by God, you shall not do all that we do here this day, every man whatsoever is fitting in his own eyes. For you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God has given you. But when you go over the Jordan and dwell in the land that the Lord your God causes you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety, then it shall come to pass that the place that the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there, there you shall bring all that I command you. Your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the offering of your hand, and all your choice vow offerings that you vow to the Lord. Right? So until you come to rest in safety, which would not be the case during the wars of conquest, which I think was 14 years, right? And God told Moses to tell the people that they would not conquer the land quickly, so that it would not, like they wouldn't be able to take over all the land quickly. They would be run over by beasts, I think, is what it says. So there was a process, and they weren't perpetually at war, but there was a process of conquering the land. And it took years. And during that period, since God had not chosen a place to put his name there, that means there was not a national altar. This was the period where there were private altars. There were still national offerings wherever the tabernacle was set up, but individual offerings didn't need to be brought there during that period. Then once they were given rest, right? Once the nation was at rest and were dwelling securely in the land of Israel, which was promised to us 3,500 years ago, as our enemies like to mock because they're mocking the Bible, and, well, their consequences be on their own heads for that. Okay, so then once God designates the place in the land where his name shall be, that's when you're going to bring all your offerings there. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters and your slaves and your maidservants, and the Levite who is within your gates, as he has no portion or inheritance with you, right? The Levites would not get a tribal land portion. They would live in the Levitical cities, and they would receive the tithe of the people, and their business was holiness. Take heed to yourself that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every place that you see, but in the place that the Lord shall choose in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. So there will be a central place, but until the Lord designates that through, it's going to be Joshua, he's going to be the prophet that's going to receive the word. Until then, then there isn't a central place. You're going to be involved in conquering the land. Okay, now we open chapter 14 with Mishnah number 1. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the longest Mishnahs. The longest is in Tractate Yuma about the Yom Kippur service, but this one I find fascinating. It begins by stating, and we're still on the topic of when are you liable for offering up outside the Holy Temple. Basic concept is you're only liable for that if you offer up an animal that would have been fit to bring on the altar inside the Holy Temple, right, in the courtyard of the Holy Temple, and you offer it up on a private altar outside the courtyard of the Holy Temple. So what are the offerings that are not fit to be brought up on the altar in the courtyard of the Holy Temple? So Mishnah 1, with regard to the red heifer of purification, right, that is not a sacrificial offering. The red heifer, there were 9 in history. It's burned in a special place, not in the Holy Temple courtyard at all, rather on the Mount of Olives opposite the Temple Mount. And it's not really an offering. It's something that is necessary for people to be purified who've come into contact with human corpses because, they buried a body, they attended a funeral, walked over a grave, etc. It would be burned along with cedar and hyssop, etc. Ashes mixed with water, and the people sprinkled even 1 drop of the waters of sprinkling on the 3rd and 7th day of somebody being purified from corpse tuma would affect the purification. So with regard to the red heifer of purification, that one burned outside its pit, right? So there was a location where it needed to be burned, but if someone didn't follow that instruction, it's hard to believe anybody would do that given how rare red heifers were. Like I said, 9 in all of Jewish history. When they have one, they were super careful to do everything correctly. But what happens if they didn't? Right. So with regard to the red heifer of purification, that one burned outside its pit, the pit being an excavation on the Mount of Olives opposite the entrance to the sanctuary designated for its slaughter and its burning. And likewise, the scapegoat of Yom Kippur, that one sacrificed outside the temple courtyard rather than casting it off a cliff as prescribed. Right? You don't sacrifice the scapegoat. The scapegoat gets taken to a special place, and it's killed as the scapegoat, but it's thrown off a cliff. So if somebody, slaughtered it and offered it up on some kind of altar, was that something that was fit to be slaughtered on the altar, slaughtered in the courtyard and sacrificed on the altar? No, because it has a different procedure. So if one did that on some private altar, he definitely did something wrong. He violated many prohibitions, but not the prohibition on offering up outside the altar. It would not come under the rubric of that law. He is exempt from punishment for violating the transgression of slaughtering and sacrificing outside the temple courtyard. The source for this, regarding the red heifer and the scapegoat, is as it is stated with regard to the slaughter of sacrificial animals outside the courtyard. Whatever man that slaughters outside the camp and to the entrance of the tent of meeting, he did not bring it, to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord. From that verse it is derived, for any offering that is not fit to come to the entrance of the tent of meeting for sacrifice on the altar, for example, the red heifer and the scapegoat, one is not liable for its slaughter and sacrifice outside of its place. Now, with regard to an animal that actively copulated with a person or an animal that was the object of bestiality, right? Disgusting, but the point is that an animal that was, used by a human in this way becomes disqualified from being brought as an offering. It can no longer be brought as an offering. So same idea. If you then slaughtered that and offered it up on a private altar, you're not guilty of this law because it doesn't qualify. It was not qualified to be placed on the altar in the courtyard of the temple. But obviously you violated other prohibitions if you engage in bestiality, and then that animal needed to be killed, right? Executed, because it was used in this way. We don't tolerate that. So with regard to an animal that actively copulated with a person, or an animal that was the object of bestiality, or an animal that was set aside for idol worship, or an animal that was worshipped as a deity, or an animal that was given as the price of a dog that was purchased, or an animal that was given as payment to a prostitute, or an animal born of a mixture of diverse kinds, or a treifa, which is an animal with an internal wound that would cause it to die within 12 months, or an animal born by cesarean section, any of which one sacrificed outside the temple courtyard, he is exempt. And the source for this is as it is stated, and to the entrance of the tent of meeting. He did not bring it to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord. And from this verse it is derived, for any animal that is not fit to come to the entrance of the tent of meeting for sacrifice on the altar, one is not liable for its slaughter and sacrifice outside the courtyard. For blemished animals, whether they are permanently blemished or whether they are temporarily blemished, now we're on 112b, which one sacrificed outside the temple courtyard, one is exempt. Again, same idea. All these animals, you may not offer them on the altar in the courtyard. Therefore, if you offered them outside the courtyard on a private altar, you haven't violated this law. Rabbi Shimon says for permanently blemished animals, one is exempt. For temporarily blemished animals, one is liable for violation of a prohibition, but it is not the type of prohibition for which you will receive charis, because ultimately the animal will be fit for sacrifice. With regard to doves whose time of fitness for sacrifice has not arrived, as they are fit for sacrifice only when they are older, after their wings assume a golden hue, and pigeons whose time of fitness has passed, as they are fit only when they are young, and their wings did not yet assume a yellowish tint, that one sacrificed outside the temple courtyard, he is exempt. Again, these are birds that are normally brought in the holy temple, but you use them at the wrong part of their life cycle. That's why you'd be exempt for offering them up outside the holy temple. Rabbi Shimon says, for pigeons whose time of fitness has passed, one is exempt. And for doves whose time of fitness has not yet arrived, he is in violation of a prohibition, but not this prohibition. With regard to an animal itself and its offspring that were slaughtered on the same day, where one violates a prohibition for slaughtering the second, and an animal whose time has not yet arrived. If one sacrificed it outside the temple courtyard, he is exempt. Rabbi Shimon says for an animal whose time has not yet arrived, that person is in violation of a mere prohibition. As Rabbi Shimon says, with regard to any sacrificial animal that is fit to come and be sacrificed after the passage of time, right, meaning it's not old enough yet, if one sacrificed it outside the courtyard, that person is in violation of a prohibition, but there is no liability for kares. And the rabbis say in any case in which there is no liability for kares, there is no violation of a prohibition. The Mishnah adds, an animal is defined as one whose time has not yet arrived, whether it is intrinsically premature, for example, doves whose wings have not yet assumed the golden hue, or an animal less than 7 days old, or whether it is premature for its owner, if the owner needs an animal in its first year, or an animal in its second year, just depending on the kind of offering, there are specifications. Which is the animal whose time has not yet arrived because it is premature for its owner? It is the animal of a man, of a zav, a man who has experienced a gonorrhea-like discharge, and a zava, a woman who experiences a discharge of uterine blood after her menstrual period, and a woman after childbirth, and a mitzora, a person who's being purified from tsaras, whose period of impurity is not yet complete. Where these owners are, so this is not that the animal's not old enough yet, it's that the person has not yet been purified so that they've reached the stage where they would bring the offerings that they need to bring in order to complete their purification. But they can't bring those animals until they've reached the right stage of their purification. Where these owners who are tameh, ritually impure, sacrifice their sin offerings or guilt offerings outside the temple courtyard, since it was not yet time for them to bring them inside the courtyard. They're not fit for the altar in the courtyard, therefore they brought them outside the courtyard. They're not liable for offering up outside the holy temple. In this case, they are exempt, as they are neither obligated nor permitted to bring those offerings. But if they sacrifice their burnt offerings or their peace offerings outside the courtyard, they are liable, as those offerings may be brought as gift offerings, even if their owner is tameh. Therefore, since those are fit for the altar, if they bring them up outside the holy temple, liability for offering up outside the temple. One who offers up outside the temple courtyard a portion of the meat of a sin offering that is eaten, of the meat of a guilt offering, of the meat of other offerings of the most sacred order that are eaten, for example, the sheep sacrificed on the festival of Shavuos, or of the meat of offerings of lesser sanctity, like peace offerings, is exempt because the meat that is eaten is not consumed by the altar in the holy temple. And for the same reason, one who sacrificed a portion of the surplus of the Omer offering, a measure of barley brought as a communal offering on the 16th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, after the handful was removed, or the 2 loaves, i.e. the public offering on Shavuos of 2 loaves from the new wheat, or the showbread arranged on the table every Shabbos in the sanctuary, or the remainder of meal offerings, is also exempt, because these things are eaten, not burned. And likewise, with regard to one who pours oil onto a meal offering, and one who breaks the loaves of the meal offering into pieces, and one who mixes oil in the flour of the meal offering. Here we're talking about steps in the process of bringing various offerings that do not complete the offering, right? In other words, people who do these steps have not created what is, have not these are just steps in the offering procedure. So if you actually do those steps outside the holy temple, you haven't offered up outside the holy temple, right? Because pouring oil onto a meal offering is not the same as putting that meal offering on the fire, right? So if you put the meal offering on the fire of a private altar, okay, you're liable for offering up outside the temple. But if you just do the step of pouring oil onto a meal offering and you do that outside the holy temple, okay, you haven't offered up. So you're not liable for offering up. That's what this whole list is that I'm doing right now. Steps in the process that aren't the actual final thing. One who salts a meal offering or other offerings, and one who waves a meal offering, and one who brings a meal offering to the corner of an altar, if he performs these actions outside the courtyard, and one who arranges showbread on the table outside the sanctuary, and one who removes the ashes from the lamps of the menorah, and one who removes a handful from a meal offering, and one who collects the blood of an offering in a vessel. If he did these things outside the temple courtyard, in all these cases, he is exempt. And this is because one is liable only if he performs an action similar to sacrifice, the actual sacrifice, meaning the part that completes the sacrificial service, while all these actions that I just named are ones that are normally followed by additional sacrificial rites. And one is likewise not liable for any of these actions, neither due to the prohibition against a non-priest performing the temple service, nor due to the prohibition against performing the temple service in a state of tuma, ritual impurity, nor due to the prohibition against the priest lacking the requisite priestly vestments while performing the temple service, nor due to the prohibition against performing the temple service without washing one's hands and feet. Because if it was a non-priest doing what is a priestly action outside the holy temple, okay, well, what he was doing is nothing, right? Because it was being done outside the temple, it's meaningless. He's violating something, but not offering up and not a non-priest doing a sacrificial rite, even a partial rite in the temple courtyard, because he's doing it outside the temple courtyard. Okay. Now we move into the second part of the Mishnah. We're still in the Mishnah, but here we're getting historical. This is the part that I told you I find fascinating. So, until the tabernacle was established, okay, so that's the Torah was given at Mount Sinai after the Jews left Egypt. And then God gave us the law and said, you're going to build a tabernacle, and that's where you're going to bring sacrifices. Prior to that, the Jews did have private altars. And who ministered, right? Who served the priestly role in those private, basically familial altars? Until the tabernacle was established, private altars were permitted, and the sacrificial service was performed by the Bechor, the firstborn, right? Until that time, the times of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the tribes, while they were living in Egypt, when they had private altars and it was permitted, who did the bringing up on the altar? The firstborn. And from the time that the tabernacle was established, private altars were prohibited. And the sacrificial service was performed by the priests, right? Aaron and the sons of Aaron. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains surrounding the courtyard of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And offerings of lesser sanctity were eaten throughout the camp of Israel, which later corresponded to Jerusalem. When the Jewish people arrived at Gilgal, entering the Holy Land, private altars were permitted. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains. There still was the tabernacle in one spot. And offerings of lesser sanctity were eaten anywhere throughout the land of Israel. When they arrived at Shiloh, private altars were prohibited again. And there was no roof of wood or stone there, i.e. in the tabernacle in Shiloh. Rather, there was only a building of stone below, and the curtains of the roof of the tabernacle were spread over it. And the period that the tabernacle was in Shiloh was characterized in the Torah as rest, right? The people had come to rest. Quote, for you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God has given you. That's when Moses is talking to them before they crossed the Jordan. When they came to Shiloh is when they achieved that period of rest and security. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains in the courtyard of the tent of meeting once they were in Shiloh, and offerings of lesser sanctity and second tithe were eaten in any place that overlooks Shiloh. Right? This was before Jerusalem had attained its importance. So at that point, the capital, the holy capital of the land, was at Shiloh. So let me interrupt the Mishnah for a second and just read you a couple of notes that are written in more kind of standard English that, I think add a little bit of color and context to this. Okay, when they arrived at Gilgal, this is where the Jewish people encamped upon their arrival in the land of Israel, and where the tabernacle stood for 14 years. The tabernacle in Gilgal also had a courtyard enclosed with curtains, as the Mishna states, offerings of the most sacred order were eaten within the curtains. There was no prohibition against sacrificing outside the tabernacle at that time, as the prohibition is predicated upon the existence of an Israelite camp, as derived from the verse, whatever man of the house of Israel that kills an ox or lamb or goat in the camp. There was no Israelite camp during the period of Gilgal because the nation was engaged in conquering and settling Eretz Yisrael. For the same reason, offerings of lesser sanctity, which generally are to be eaten in the Israelite camp, could be eaten anywhere in the land of Israel. The Tosefta indicates that since at the time of the conquest of the land of Israel, the ark traveled before the people and was not normally located in the tent of meeting, the tabernacle did not have the status of the tabernacle of the Lord, but rather of a great public altar. That's the first note. When they arrived at Shiloh, after describing the conquest and division of the land, the verse states, and the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled themselves together at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there, and the land was subdued before them. It took till Joshua chapter 18 for that to happen. It was there that the ark was located on a permanent basis, and the divine presence was manifest in Shiloh for 369 years, until the death of Eli the priest. This is like this temporary period. I mean, you see why the Jewish view of history is not like other people's. We've been around a really long time, right? So that kind of temporary time where we had a temporary capital in Shiloh before the main capital was established at Jerusalem was 370 years, right? There was a period actually in between Shiloh and Jerusalem, which was we're going to get to that in a second. But, the United States is going to, thank God, celebrate its 250th anniversary this year. Incredible, wonderful, amazing. I remember when I was a kid celebrating the bicentennial. Some of you are old enough. You remember the tall ships. We had a big parade, and we used to have a Memorial Day parade every year. It was nice patriotism in the 70s in our suburban town in New York. But think about, how America has changed. It's like unrecognizable 250 years after the creation of the United States. Shiloh stood for 370 years, right? And that was just the first phase. The tabernacle in Shiloh was not the portable one that had been utilized in the wilderness. It is referred to as the house of the Lord in 1 Samuel 1:24. This is where the story of Hannah, who prayed for a son, she was barren, her husband's other wife, Peninnah, I think that was her name, had a lot of kids. Hannah was really broken and devastated, and she cried her heart out before the Lord at this house in Shiloh and said to God, if you give me a son, I'll dedicate him to the Lord, for his whole life. And her prayer was answered. By the way, we learn from Hannah, much as people like to say that Judaism is so patriarchal, and it is in many ways, but our model of how to pray is Hannah. All people learn to pray from the example set by Hannah. And that was at Shiloh. And then the son that was born would be the prophet Samuel, who would anoint first Saul, the failed king, and then David, the eternal king. And his line will forever be the kings of Israel. And when Mashiach comes, he'll be a descendant of King David. Okay, so the tabernacle in Shiloh was not the portable one that had been utilized in the wilderness. It is referred to as the house of the Lord and temple, and it had doors. And it was still called tent of meeting and tabernacle For example, and he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent that he had made to dwell among men, in Psalm 78. Shiloh is located in the hills of Samaria, north of Jerusalem, and archaeological excavations have been undertaken there in recent years. And second tithe was not mentioned in the context of Gilgal. There was no obligation to bring it until Eretz Yisrael was conquered and divided, which took place immediately before the period of Shiloh. Okay, so lasted 369 years. Eventually it came to an end, right? The period where Shiloh was the capital. When the ark of the Lord was captured by the Philistines. Obviously, the level of the nation had fallen if it was possible for the Philistines to capture the ark of the Lord. But this was a time when we could still learn from our mistakes and atone. And capturing the ark was not good for the Philistines. This is generally a principle that we've seen throughout history. When we, as a nation, fall in spiritual stature, too many Jews are disconnected from Torah. Too many Jews are not following the laws of the Torah. So we, the entire Jewish people, become vulnerable. And at the end of the day, basically, Jew hate, anti-Semitism, it's always been there. It's basically a whip, a stick with which God hits us and tries to remind us to, come back to Torah. If the whole nation would be keeping Shabbos, if all the Jews in the world would attach themselves to Torah and do what we're supposed to do, we would be much stronger and we would not be victims in any way. You can argue with me all you want. That's what our tradition says. But the point being that, okay, there has always been Jew hate, and there, until Mashiach comes, there may always be Jew hate. And they will succeed to some extent in their Jew hate, which they can't even understand why they do it. I mean, the arguments of Jew haters never make any sense. These days, it's about Israel. The communists gave different reasons. The Nazis gave different reasons. The Tsar gave different reasons. The Romans and Greeks and Babylonians and Ottomans, they all gave different reasons. The Spaniards, they all gave different reasons for hating the Jews. But it's a spiritual battle. They just hated us. They couldn't even explain it to themselves because it's irrational. They could succeed for a time in hurting us, but it never goes well for the Jew haters, right? They're just a stick. They're all too happy to be the stick, but they perish from being the stick, right? So when they captured the Ark of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark with the tablets of the Ten Commandments in it, in that war, they brought it back to, the Philistine area, and it's like, ha, 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 we beat the Jews. And then they started having plagues and famine and all kinds of terrible things. They're like, oh, that was a bad idea. So they sent it back, and the Ark came back on a cart pulled by cows, unaccompanied by a human. God guided the cows, and they found their way back. So when the Ark of the Lord was captured by the Philistines and Eli the priest died, the tabernacle was destroyed, and the divine presence did not return to it, as the verse states, and he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh. Now again, you were just told before that, this was actually a house of stone, or not anything magnificent like the Holy Temple would be, but it had doors, right? And so they used the covering of the tabernacle in the wilderness. That's what the Philistines destroyed. But a lot of elements of the tabernacle in the wilderness were not being used as the tabernacle in Shiloh. And I believe I've heard elsewhere that the Midrash says that it was buried. It's buried away. And I guess when Mashiach comes, it'll be restored. I don't know if it'll be used. I think the third temple will be built. That's what Ezekiel says. But the tabernacle itself was never destroyed. And because it was built by, the willing, voluntary contributions of the Jews in the wilderness, unlike, the forced labor of Solomon's temple. It's for another day. Okay, so the tabernacle was subsequently located in the priestly city of Nov. Yet the ark was not there, but in Kiryas Jearim. and later in the city of David, right? So that's why you now have a period where the ark is in one place, the tabernacle is in the priestly city of Nov. We don't have a central tabernacle with the altar and the ark. So therefore, this is not a time when private altars are prohibited. This would be another period where private altars were permitted. After Saul wiped out the priests of Nov, you could see why Saul was unfit to be king. The verse mentions the great public altar in Gibeon, which was a location of the tabernacle during the reign of King David, until he selected Jerusalem, and to which Solomon traveled from Jerusalem to sacrifice his offerings before building the temple. During this period, offerings were sacrificed at other locations as well. The sages identify a source for a source. I think that's a misprint. The sages identify a source for the permitting of private altars during this period, in the Torah specifying only rest, i.e. Shiloh, and inheritance, Jerusalem, which allows for a period between Shiloh and Jerusalem during which private altars were permitted. Additionally, private altars were permitted because the ark was not located in the tabernacle during this period. Okay, so that's a little digression, understanding the periods of Shiloh and later Nov and Gibeon, and the initial period of Gilgal. Okay, I read that. I'm going to read it again. When they arrived at Shiloh, private altars were prohibited. And there was no roof of wood or stone there, i.e. in the tabernacle in Shiloh. Rather, there was only a building of stone below, and the curtains of the roof of the tabernacle were spread above it. And the period that the tabernacle was in Shiloh was characterized in the Torah as rest. In the verse, for you have not as yet come to rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God has given you. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains in the courtyard of the tent of meeting, and offerings of lesser sanctity and second tithe were eaten in any place that overlooks Shiloh. When Shiloh was destroyed, 1 Samuel chapter 4, the Jewish people arrived with the tabernacle at Nov and later at Gibeon, and private altars were permitted. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains in the courtyard of the tent of meeting, and offerings of lesser sanctity were eaten in all of the cities of Eretz Yisrael. When the Jewish people arrived at Jerusalem and built the temple during the reign of Solomon, private altars were prohibited. And private altars did not have a subsequent period when they were permitted. Once God designated Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the Jewish people, private altars were never permitted again anywhere. Even though God knew, obviously God knows everything, past, present, and future, that the temple would eventually be destroyed and the Jews scattered all over the world, private altars would not become permitted again. This tells you that Jerusalem has always been consecrated and designated since its initial consecration as the eternal capital, holy capital of the Jewish people, and the place where, when Mashiach comes, the third temple will stand. And the temple in Jerusalem was characterized as an inheritance. In the verse, for you have not yet as come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God has given you. Inheritance, designated by God. You know, people could look at this discussion and say, oh, the Jews, they think they're so entitled. Well, we were given Jerusalem to be our holy temple forever, and with it came tremendous responsibility and accountability, which we have not always lived up to, sadly, not nearly, and we paid a steep price. So if people are going to be jealous of us, they should be jealous of the whole package. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains, i.e. in the temple courtyard, and the offerings of lesser sanctity and second tithe were eaten within the walls of the city, whose legal status was like that of the Israelite camp in the wilderness. With regard to all offerings that one consecrated during a period of prohibition of private altars, and sacrificed during a period of prohibition of private altars, if he sacrificed them outside their designated area, for these animals, he is in violation of both the positive mitzvah to sacrifice the offering in the place chosen by God, and the prohibition against sacrificing them on a private altar, and he is liable to receive kares for doing it. If one consecrated the animals during a period of permitting private altars and sacrificed them during a period of prohibition of private altars outside their designated area, for these animals he is in violation of the positive mitzvah and the prohibition, but he is not liable to receive kares for sacrificing them. If he consecrated the animals during a period of prohibition of private altars and he sacrificed them during a period when private altars are permitted outside their designated area, for these animals he is in violation of the positive mitzvah for failure to bring it to the tabernacle, but these animals are not subject to a prohibition since they are permitted to be sacrificed on a private altar. And these are the sacrificial items that are sacrificed. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And these are the sacrificial items that are sacrificed only in the tabernacle, even when private altars are permitted. Now we're drawing that distinction. When private altars are permitted, still only for individual offerings, not communal offerings. And these are the sacrificial items that are sacrificed only in the tabernacle, even when private altars are permitted. Sacrificial animals that were presumed to be consecrated for sacrifice in the tabernacle. If it was consecrated to be brought in the tabernacle, then you have to bring it in the tabernacle. Therefore, communal offerings are sacrificed in the tabernacle. But offerings of an individual may be sacrificed on a private altar. In addition, with regard to offerings of an individual that were consecrated expressly for sacrifice in the tabernacle, one must sacrifice them in the tabernacle. But if he sacrificed them on a private altar, he is exempt. So interesting. He consecrated, said, I'm going to bring this to the tabernacle. And then he ends up bringing it out, offering it up outside during a period when private altars are permitted. So he should have brought it to the tabernacle, but he's not liable for offering up outside in that situation. And what is the difference between the private altar of an individual and the public altar at the site of the tabernacle when it was located in Gilgal, when private altars were permitted, or Nov and Gibeon, when private altars were permitted? It is that in a private altar, there is no placing of hands on the head of an offering, known as smicha, no slaughter in the north, which we do for offerings of the most sacred order, which can only be done in the north of the courtyard of the Holy Temple. Now we're at the top of 113a. No placement of blood around all the sides of the altar in offerings for which this is required. No waving of meal offerings and no bringing of meal offerings to the corner of the altar prior to the removal of the handful. These procedures can only be done in the Holy Temple. Rabbi Yehuda says there is no meal offering sacrificed on an altar outside the temple, and requiring a member of the priesthood to perform the sacrificial rites, the priestly service vestments, the service vessel, the pleasing aroma to God, right? You only get the pleasing aroma to God on the national altar, where it says in the Torah that if you bring up offerings here, it will be a pleasing aroma to God. It doesn't say that about private altars. The partition for the blood, i.e. the red line dividing the upper and lower halves of the altar, and the priest's washing of hands and feet before his service, all do not apply to sacrifice on private altars, as the service there need not be performed by priests, nor follow the protocols of all the protocols of the temple service. But the intent to sacrifice or partake of the offering beyond its designated time, which renders the offering pigul, the law of portions of the offering that are left over, nosar, beyond its time that may be eaten, and the prohibition against eating consecrated meat while tameh, ritually impure, are equal in this, a private altar as compared to the public altar. Right? So there still is pigul, nosar, and you can't eat the meat while tameh, even if you're bringing the offering on a private altar. And that concludes Mishna number 1 of the final chapter of the tractate, chapter 14. As you can see, it was a lengthy Mishnah. Okay, I'm only seeing one question. But wouldn't there, Sharon says, but wouldn't there be the appearance of acceptability if one who did not know that the second animal was disqualified and someone saw it being offered outside of the temple? It gives the perception that offering up an animal outside of the temple is acceptable. That's fascinating. Great point. I would think that it's prohibited on top of the chorus-bearing doraisa prohibition, right? Written Torah prohibition. We still don't do this, right? Like I keep saying, it's going to be prohibited. It just hasn't triggered liability for the chorus-bearing prohibition written in the Torah. So when we say that you shouldn't do something because it has the appearance of impropriety and it could lead others to think that, that's generally a formula for for a rabbinic ordinance, right? For a rabbinic ordinance, a derabanan. Right? The rabbis would say you can't do something because it has the appearance of violating a Torah prohibition, but violating a rabbinic prohibition is not going to be the same kind of chorus-bearing penalty as violating what's in the written Torah. So I'm not sure if that derabanan actually existed, but your point is a good one. How would people know that this is the second animal that's being brought, outside, and that it's therefore technically permitted? Really, just again, it's not permitted. He's exempt. That's quite different, right? Okay, he's exempt from chorus for violating the Torah prohibition. Doesn't mean it's permitted, especially with respect to a rabbinic prohibition. It just hasn't triggered that particular liability. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll see you tomorrow after Shabbos ends here in LA. It's starting to become sometime between 6:30 and 7 p.m. Pacific. All the best. May you have a good Shabbos. May we hear only good news going into Shabbos, during Shabbos, and coming out of Shabbos. Good Shabbos.